I was named to the task force for transportation and trains and our infrastructure with not only our roads and bridges, but certainly our train transportation in our urban areas, as well as making sure that we have access when we're more suburban or rural areas. That's a huge issue right now, and obviously the issue with the turnpike and the dollars going to PennDOT and how we pay for our trains. So our trains are something that we're really looking closely at. So if any of you have any insights, I know a lot of you have experience with the industry as a whole in the past. Please feel free to offer those suggestions or things that you've observed or your experiences, because the more information that we can have, the better. And folks like you that have had that experience, all the better. So congratulations on your train. I know Lou will do a great job in giving you some more information, and thanks for the invitation to be here, and enjoy the presentation.
Thank you all for having me here today. I'm delighted to be here. As George mentioned, I am a state representative from the 79th Legislative District, which includes the entire city of Altoona, and which, by the way, a lot of people don't know, there are more people collecting railroad pensions in the city of Altoona, Pennsylvania than any other city in the United States. And as you might know, the railroad pensions are federal pensions. They're separate. They're federal pensions, and there's also a wife's pension or a widow's pension as well. So it's not just the worker that collects the pension, but the widow and the surviving spouse also collects a pension. So I'm particularly glad to be here with so many people who I know love the railroad and are knowledgeable about the railroad. And it's a delight to be here with Representative Delozier. She's a wonderful representative, and it's always great for me. You might think at 6'9" that there aren't too many people I look up to, but she's one of the ones I look up to. I'm a freshman. I'm in my first term in the House of Representatives, and so I need to have role models in the House that I can look at and say, these are the kind of legislators I want to be, and she certainly fits that bill. So you're lucky to have her as a representative. Anyway, my story, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. My story goes back to 1907 in the city of Vilshofen in Lower Bavaria, Germany. That's known as Niederbayern in German. And that area, that city sits on what we in German call the Donau River. Everybody else calls it the Danube River. But in Germany, it's known as the Donau River. And the city of Vilshofen sits on that river. And in 1907, a young man by the name of Johann Schmitt decided that he was going to come to America, come to the New World. So he got on a ship and he crossed over to Ellis Island, and he wanted to come to America to work on the Pennsylvania Railroad. So he gets to Ellis Island, and when he got to Ellis Island, he had something going on, like bronchitis or pneumonia or something like that. So they would not let him into the country. The doctors said he had to go back to Germany. So they put him on a ship, and they shipped him back to Germany. Now, in the old days, when the U.S. government wouldn't let you in, they had to pay your way back. So they bought him a ticket, and they sent him back to Germany. Well, Johann got off the ship in Germany. He got right back onto another ship in Germany, and he came right back to the United States. He made his third crossing of the Atlantic Ocean. And this time, the doctors let him in. So Johann got on a train in New York and went straight to Altoona and went to work for the Pennsylvania Railroad. And Johann worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad until 1930, when he passed away from stomach cancer. Now, interesting thing about Johann, when they let him into the United States, they asked him what his name was. Now, in German, D's are pronounced like T's. So when they said, "What's your name?" he said, "Johann Schmitt." So Johann Schmitt, S-C-H-M-I-D in Germany, became Johann Schmitt, S-C-H-M-I-T-T in the United States. And that was my grandfather. So he worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad until 1930. My father, Louis Sr., was born in Altoona in 1922. In 1930, his dad died. He was only 8 years old. He had 4 younger brothers and sisters. But at 8 years old, it was the height of the Great Depression. It was 1930. He became the man of the house. So he and his younger brother, who was 7, actually went to work. They dug graves. They shoveled coal for 25 cents a ton. They dug ditches. They did whatever they could. My grandmother took in wash. She didn't speak very good English, but she took in wash to help the family make ends meet. In 1940, when my dad graduated from Altoona High, he took a walk down to the shop foreman's house for the PRR shops in Juniata in Altoona. And it was a Sunday. He knocked on the shop foreman's door. I guess it was the shop manager maybe. The manager came out, and my dad said, "Look, I'm Lou Schmitt. I'm supporting my family. I'm 18 years old. I've been supporting my family since I was 8 years old. I'm a hard worker. I need a job. And if you hire me, I promise you, you'll never regret it. And so the plant manager said, I'll tell you what, kid, come to the shop tomorrow. So the next day, Monday, my dad went to the Juniata shops of the PRR, and they gave him a broom. And that's how he started out working for the PRR. He became an electrician for the Pennsylvania Railroad, and he worked there from 1940 until 1982 when he retired. At that point, he had been with the Pennsylvania Railroad, then it was Penn Central, and then it was Conrail. He actually retired from Conrail, my dad. Except for, on December 7, 1941, my dad was playing touch football in Altoona, out in the street. He was some buddies. They came in, they turned on the radio, and they found out that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. So my dad enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Corps. We didn't have a separate Air Force in those days. He enlisted in the Air Corps, and he was a tail gunner on a B-17 bomber. And then he found out that they were starting this new kind of Army group called the paratroopers, and they had nicer uniforms. So my dad was a little bit of a peacock, so he liked the nicer uniforms, and I think they got more pay. So he enlisted in the paratroopers. He was in the paratroopers, and during a training jump, he suffered a real bad concussion, and they told him, you can't jump anymore. So then they reassigned him to the 116th Combat Regiment, Infantry Regiment, Company G of the 29th Infantry Division. So on D-Day, June the 6th, 1944, at 6:30 in the morning, my dad was in the first wave that hit Omaha Beach in the Dog Red sector. And one of the miracles that leads me to even be here today is that when my dad's landing craft was approaching the beach, it drifted about 1,000 yards to the east. So they were out of position. And when the ramp came down, there had been some smoke from bombardment earlier that came down the beach, and it briefly covered the front of my dad's landing craft. So when they came off the landing craft, the Germans couldn't see them very well. Well, the smoke then lifted pretty quickly, and within about 20 minutes, 50% of the guys in my dad's company were dead crossing that beach. But he made it off the beach, and then later on in a counterattack in France, he was captured, and he spent the rest of the war in Stalag 4B. So he was also a prisoner of war. But the funny thing what my dad told me was, when he came back from World War II, he said, I got off the train in Altoona on a Friday. He said, and Monday I was back in the shops working for the railroad. So a lot of people, when they're kids, they go to bed and they hear lullabies before they go to bed. Well, living in Altoona, I heard boxcars banging and train whistles, and those were my lullabies. I always have loved the Pennsylvania Railroad and the railroad in general. As a kid in Altoona, especially in those days in the 60s and 70s, I thought everybody in the world worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad. I didn't know that there was anything other than the Pennsylvania Railroad. You have to keep in mind that the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1849 founded the city of Altoona. It was centrally located, so they could do their boxcars and locomotive repairs and rebuildings and buildings in that area without having to ship from all over the state, across the state. It was right in the middle of the state. So, and at one time, those Juniata shops in Altoona employed 17,000 men. They're down to about 500 or 600 now. So my father worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad. My grandfather worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad. On my mother's side, my mother's father, Vito Civiello, was a welder for the Pennsylvania Railroad. He worked out in the Samuel Ray shops in Hollidaysburg. My wife's father worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad. My wife's grandfather worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad. Our hospital in Altoona, it's now UPMC Altoona, started out as the Altoona Hospital. That started out actually as the first aid station for the railroad. That was where because it was near the shops. That's where they would take them. The railroad built what was called the cricket field back in the old days, and they used to play baseball there and sports. Babe Ruth played there. That started out as a field where the railroaders could compete with each other and have leagues. They had sports leagues, and that continued up until the 1980s. They continued to have sports leagues for the railroad. When you would go to the hospital in Altoona, and my mom would take me in when I was a little boy to the hospital for some reason, if I had a fever or whatever, the nurses and doctors wouldn't even ask. They would just say, oh, you're insured by Travelers through the railroad. Everybody was involved with the railroad. And I will tell you one of the great memories I have of the railroad. I was a little boy, and I was standing up on, and by the way, I was born and raised in the Dutch Hill neighborhood of Altoona. It was all Germans. I went to St. Mary's parochial school, which was in those days, we had very ethnic parochial schools. It was all German. In fact, St. Mary's is so German that if you ever go to St. Mary's Church in Altoona and you look at the Stations of the Cross that are on the inside of the church, they're written in German. So that was how German St. Mary's was. But my dad was born and raised in that neighborhood. I was born and raised in the old Dutch Hill neighborhood. It's right behind Altoona High. But one of my enduring memories is as a boy, probably about maybe 8 or 9 years old. I was standing on 4th Avenue, which the avenue we lived on, in 12th Street, and it's a hill in Altoona. And from that vantage point, I could see down to the where the Altoona Railroaders Museum is now. But in those days, in the old days, those were all shops along that area. And I remember at 3 o'clock, that's when the railroaders would get off. At 3 o'clock, the whistle would blow, and I saw something that I'll never forget. Just thousands and thousands of men pouring out of these shops and walking up the hills into the neighborhoods of Altoona. They were all dressed the same. They all had their lunch pails with them. And it was an unbelievable sight just to see. And it went on for 15, 20 minutes, just men pouring out of these shops. That was what the railroad meant to Altoona back in those days. So I'm the first generation in my family that hasn't worked in the Pennsylvania Railroad. And I remember as a kid, my dad had a pass. We could ride anywhere we wanted on the railroad. So we would often get on the railroad and take trips to New York City for free. We would just ride up to New York City for the day and maybe spend the night on the train and get up to New York and spend some time in New York, and then we would ride back home. So many people worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad in my neighborhood, the Dutch Hill neighborhood, that if somebody's dad didn't work for the Pennsylvania Railroad, we thought there was something wrong with them. Like, why isn't your dad working at the railroad? Wouldn't they take him? I mean, we couldn't figure out why these folks wouldn't be working for the Pennsylvania Railroad. So the railroad's in my blood. It's one of the things that is so important to me. It was one of the reasons I wanted to get on the Transportation Committee, and I was particularly happy to be on the Subcommittee on Railroads, let alone be the chairman of the Subcommittee on Railroads. But when that happened, I thanked the Speaker for putting me as the chairman of the House Subcommittee on Railroads, and he said, "Where else would I put a boy from Altoona?" So it kind of runs in my blood. I think the railroads have a bright future. I really, really do. You have to keep in mind that about 40% of the freight that moves in the United States moves by rail. A train can hold up to 300 trailers that would otherwise be on 300 trucks on the roads, causing damage and wear and tear to our bridges and our road system, our infrastructure, causing congestion. Those things can be put on a train, and a train can haul 300 of those trailers. Also, too, trains are pretty environmentally green. You put 300 of those trailers on one train, compared to having 300 tractor trailers on the road, belching out all the exhaust and the smoke, congesting the roads. So trains are pretty clean, and they're pretty green, and they're pretty competitive when it comes to shipping things. The other thing that a lot of people don't know about railroads is the infrastructure. Like the rail line from Altoona to Pittsburgh is owned by Norfolk Southern. So the infrastructure that the railroads move on is actually privately owned by the railroads. And last year, I think it was about $20 billion that the railroads invested in their own infrastructure to upgrade and maintain those rail lines. So it's not like highways, where the taxpayers have to pay to maintain and upgrade highways and repair bridges and to remedy all the damage and wear and tear that's done by vehicles. The rails are owned by the railroad companies. So they're the ones who invest. They're the ones who invest in maintaining and upgrading those railroad tracks and those rail beds. We just had a meeting of the Transportation Committee at the end of August in Altoona, and we talked a little bit about passenger rail in western Pennsylvania. At this point, we only have one train a day in each direction, and it's impossible for somebody to leave Altoona in the morning and go to Pittsburgh and spend the day and maybe come back in the evening. You have to stay overnight, or take the early morning train to Pittsburgh and then stay overnight and take a train that doesn't come back until the next morning to Altoona. So, and I know this because one of my daughters went to Pitt, and she would take the train. It was impossible for her to go over and back in one day. So I always thought that if we could get 2 or 3 more trains on that line, so that we had service where people could get to Pittsburgh and get back in the same day, that would unlock economic productivity and development in that entire corridor, from Altoona through Johnstown and Latrobe and Greensburg, the whole way over to Pittsburgh. And I don't think people understand that investments in infrastructure pay huge dividends. And I'm talking about public investments. I'm talking about taxpayer investments. They do 2 things that other tax dollars don't do very well sometimes. And that is, number one, when you invest in infrastructure, it creates jobs now. And these are good paying, family sustaining jobs, number one. Number two, it lays the foundation, literally, It lays the foundation for economic development in the future. 30 years ago, I lived in Pittsburgh, and there's a busway in Pittsburgh that goes from the downtown out through the eastern part of the city, through Homewood, and out in that area. And I lived in an apartment out there, and the busway had been built not too long before that. And around that busway, in those days, 30 years ago, it was a very bad neighborhood. Homewood was a very, very bad neighborhood. East Liberty, terrible neighborhood. It was a ghetto. There was lots of drugs and crime and violence. I hadn't been back to that area in probably about 25 years. And then earlier this year, I took a tour of the busway with the Transportation Committee. And when we went out that busway, I couldn't believe the difference. Google, Amazon, the National Robotics Science Center is out there, Carnegie Mellon. They're building condominium blocks of condominiums out there that are selling for $300,000 and $400,000, and they can't build them fast enough. People were snapping them up. The ghetto is gone, and this beautiful urban area has grown up. And it's grown up in that area because of the access to the busway, because of good transportation. Years ago, I was flying into Toronto in a plane with a buddy of mine who was from Toronto. And as we were making our final approach into the city, I looked down and I could just see, and it was at night, I could just see these pockets of all these lights in these certain areas. And I said to my friend, I said, why are these areas so lit up just in these specific places? And he says, those are train stations. So when you build the infrastructure and the transportation and the mobility means the moving of people as opposed to the moving of goods, which is transportation. When you improve access to those things and when you improve those things themselves, the economy sprouts up around those things. It sprouts up around those things. And I've been saying for a long time that one person in one car driving is a model of mobility that is simply unsustainable at this point. If you think about it, look at the congestion. If you ever drive into Pittsburgh on the Parkway East, really any time of day now, you're sitting in traffic. You're not moving. And people don't realize, but that actually puts a hidden tax on all of us because these folks aren't at work. You know, they can't be productive. They can only sit in their car and traffic and breathe exhaust until they actually get to work. So it's simply not sustainable. We can't build roads and improve our bridges and widen out our lanes fast enough to keep up with the demand for that kind of travel. So I think, and you know the other thing too, these young kids, these millennials, they don't want to do that. The young millennials love trains. They love public transport. They love buses. They love trams. They like to walk to work. They like to ride a bike to work. My daughter lives in Pittsburgh with my son-in-law. They take the light rail commuter train in from Dormont, Pennsylvania into Pittsburgh. Young kids love that sort of transportation and mobility, and that's what they want. It's not affordable anymore to put one person in one car and have them sit in traffic. It puts too much wear and tear on our bridges and roads. It creates too much pollution. Greenhouse gases belching out of these vehicles. It's too expensive to maintain and upgrade those vehicular traffic arteries, and it's terrible for our environment. Terrible for our environment. So I think as we move forward into the future, you're going to see more in terms of passenger rail, and I think freight rail is very competitive when it comes to shipping things. Trucks have an advantage when it's 1 day or less shipping because they can get to more points in 1 day or less. But once you get past the 1 day threshold, then rail is very, very competitive with trucks. And the other thing about trucks, too, that people don't understand, and people who have trucking companies don't like it when I say this, but when I talk about passenger rail, people say, oh, we have to subsidize it. We have to subsidize passenger rail. That's true. Every country subsidizes passenger rail. If you ever go to Europe, the trains there are incredible. These bullet trains that go from country to country, they are absolutely incredible. Every country subsidizes the passenger rail. But one thing people don't realize is that we are providing an invisible subsidy to the trucking companies because the heavy trucks on our roads, the wear and tear that they put on our roads and bridges, when it comes to the fees that they pay and the money that they send back to the state for using our infrastructure system, they only cover about 60% of the wear and tear that they put on our roads and bridges. We have to cover the other 40%. People don't see that, but that's the reality, is we're actually covering about 40% of the damage. The taxpayers are, that those trucks do. So do we have to subsidize rail? Yeah, we have to subsidize rail. But we're subsidizing other transportation and mobility already. I think I love the idea of high-speed rail. One of my predecessors, Rick Geist, who was from Altoona. He held my seat and was chairman of the Transportation Committee for many years, was an advocate for high-speed rail. I said, high-speed rail, I'm an advocate for, I'll take low-speed rail. We just need more connections in western Pennsylvania. All those communities along that line will thrive if we can improve service to Pittsburgh from Altoona in that corridor. And the other thing about improving service and putting more trains in, when you put more trains in and people have more choices in terms of scheduling, you get more riders. Ridership actually increases when you have more scheduled trains because people now can build their schedule around the train schedule. When there's one in each direction every day, it's not even really a thought for people to take the train most of the time, and you can't go over and back in one day. If you've got 3 or 4 choices during the day to get you there and to get you back, it's going to become much more attractive for people to take the train. And nowadays, as you all know, I have a daughter that's 29, and she only goes into the office 1 day a week in Pittsburgh. The other 4 days she works from home. Nowadays, these young people especially can work from anywhere. And so if somebody wants to have a nice job in Pittsburgh and yet live in Johnstown or Altoona, where their money will go a lot farther, or maybe that's where their hometown is, and they only have to go to Pittsburgh once a week. If we have better rail service to Pittsburgh, it's easy for them to stay in Altoona and Johnstown and live and work remotely from home and then take the train back and forth once a week. The other great thing about the train, if you drive from Altoona to Pittsburgh, you have to come out of Altoona into Cambria County, go up over Crescent Mountain, and you're up in the mountains, up past Chicory and all these places before you then go down to Blairsville and get out of the mountains. And let me tell you, I've made that trip 1,000 times, and it's no joke, especially in the wintertime. Even in the summer, in nice weather, you get a lot of fog up in those ridges. It's no joke making that drive. Well, you get on a train, you don't have to worry about that. You don't have to worry about the weather. You don't have to worry about snow. And the other beautiful thing about the train is, especially for these young folks, they can work in the train. They bring their computers and they spend that 2.5 hours between Altoona and Pittsburgh doing work and on the same way coming home. You can't work when you're sitting in a car in traffic on the Parkway East. So I'm a huge advocate for rail. I think that's one of the reasons why they made me chairman of the subcommittee on rail. I'm going to push for increased service, especially in my part of the world, western Pennsylvania. I know that from Harrisburg East, you've got pretty good service. I mean, you've got a lot of trains that go from Harrisburg to Philadelphia, and you're very fortunate. God bless you. But out in the western part of the state, we're kind of in the desert now, and we need more passenger service, and I'm certainly an advocate for that. So that's my story. That's kind of what I'm about. That's what I'm doing. Do any of you have any questions that you would like me to answer?
Yeah, well, the big thing about our thing here is that the railroads connect right directly to the airports.
Yes.
That's the key.
And that's a great point. And that's another thing with these young kids. It's not like they want to get in a car and go somewhere. They want to get on a train and go somewhere. They have no problem going from a train to a plane or coming into Pittsburgh on a train and then getting one of these Ubers or Lyfts. And what would be ideal would be for a young kid, they can call Uber. The Uber can pick them up at their house in Altoona, take them to the train station. They can get on the train, go to Pittsburgh, and then get on a plane in Pittsburgh and travel that way. And that's intermodal mobility, moving from one mode of transport to another. And these kids are used to doing that. You know, my daughter drives her car to the station in Pittsburgh, parks at the station, gets on the commuter train, and takes the commuter train into Pittsburgh. So intermodal, they're using more than one mode. And I think that's going to be key, is to connect these networks together. And I will tell you guys another thing. It's not just an issue of quality of life for us here in Pennsylvania, though it certainly is an issue. That is a huge issue, which I think can be improved with better train service. But right now, as we speak, China has embarked on the greatest infrastructure investment program that the world has ever seen. And I will tell you this, the country of China means to surpass us. They mean to surpass us economically. They mean to surpass us militarily. And one of the ways that they're doing that is investing in their infrastructure. And we need to invest in our infrastructure in a big way. It's a huge challenge to come up with the funding to do it. It's an awesome challenge, but we have to do it as a matter of national security. If the United States of America is going to remain competitive in our world today, we have to make that investment. And that investment sometimes is tough because some of us in our own lives won't see it, me included. We won't see the fruits of the investment. But future generations will, our children, our grandchildren. And if we're going to remain the #1 country in the world, a top flight country, we have to have an infrastructure that is going to allow us to compete with the Chinas of the world. Any other?
Just
Yes.
a side note,
Yeah.
if you can imagine this elevated rail as a high-speed
Yeah.
rail, 200-300 miles, you know, say from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh,
Maglev, yeah.
you know,
That would be awesome.
you're above everything.
Well, that's the beauty of it too. You know, you don't have to get rights of way and dig and lay new rail track. I mean, you put it up and you elevate it, and that way you're not interfering with the other surface transport. 5 years ago, when my wife and I celebrated our 30th wedding anniversary, we took a trip to Europe, and we flew from Newark. We drove to Newark, flew over to London, and then in London we got the Eurostar train that goes under the English Channel, and we took that, which was really cool. We took that to Paris. And then we got off in Paris. And what we did was we spent some time in Paris, and then we went to Munich and Austria, and then up to Amsterdam, and we went to Brussels. We went all around Europe, but we went by train. And the trains were amazing. They were going 200, 250 miles an hour, and you couldn't tell that you're even moving. And I remember we were going from Amsterdam to Rotterdam, and we only had 2 minutes in between trains to get from one train to another. And I remember saying to the conductor, you know, this train's supposed to arrive in Rotterdam at 3:18 p.m., and we're supposed to get on another train at 3:20 p.m. I said, I'm thinking Altoona. You know, in the old days, the train would be 8 hours late. And so I said to him, I'm concerned here. You know, he said, don't worry. I said, really? I said, 2 minutes? He said, don't worry. So we took the train, we got to Rotterdam. We got to Rotterdam at 3:18, exactly when we were supposed to, got off of it. Got off that train, walked down 3 or 4 platforms to the next train, got on it, 3:20, that train left. It's unbelievable how they run their train system. And the train under the channel, I mean, public transportation in Europe is so far advanced. Now, I will also say this, the tax rates in Europe are really, really high. They put a lot of money into their transportation. But I was so impressed with the trains, and if we can start to develop our transportation and our train system here, I would love to see those high-speed trains in the U.S. I mean, it would zip us around. You could go from country to country in an hour over in Europe. You could get to Harrisburg to Pittsburgh, be there in an hour. I mean, and I talked to my daughter. I did a little research, because she's a millennial, and I said to her, Lauren, you know, what would the commute time need to be for you to live in Altoona and go back and forth to work in Pittsburgh? And she said, Dad, she said, anything probably over an hour I wouldn't do. Because a lot of people spend an hour now who live in Pittsburgh or the suburbs getting to their jobs downtown. She said, if you could get a train from Altoona to Pittsburgh in an hour, she said, you'd have people that would commute back and forth to Pittsburgh to work. So that would be, down the road would be the thought. If we can get something high speed enough that it can get to Pittsburgh in an hour. Now, the other thing you have to keep in mind is Norfolk Southern owns that line. So their freight trains are on that line, and they're going to this precision schedule railroading. They're running bigger, heavier trains, fewer trains, and so those trains have to be able to get out of the way if we were going to run passenger rail that's going to be faster. And the federal law says that passenger rail takes precedence over freight. The problem is the railroads almost never follow that law. They just kind of ignore it. And they don't want to get out of the way because they want to move their freight. And I understand they're making money, they're moving freight. So that's an issue we'd have to deal with. We'd have to build more sidings and probably longer sidings so we could get the freight out of the way and let the passenger rail through. But I think if we could do that, and if we could get it to a point where we could get back and forth to Pittsburgh 1 hour in each direction, I think that whole area of Pennsylvania, that western part of Pennsylvania would boom, and it would keep our young people there too, which is a real problem, keeping young people in Altoona and Johnstown in these cities.
Well, there's another point on the railroads. The railroads have torn up a lot of track. There's a picture in our brochure we're going to hand you. It shows the Rockville Bridge, and it shows a missing track there that they tore up. So that can be used for elevated or high speed.
It's there.
It's there.
It's
And
there.
if you can convince them to use it.
Well, that's the thing, is convincing the railroads. You know, railroads, they're pretty stubborn. And railroaders, believe me, are pretty stubborn too. At one time, we had, I can't remember how many, 8, 10, 12 tracks in Altoona on what we called the main line. They would go under, there was a bridge that went from one part of Altoona to the other. It's where the zip code changed. I was a 16601 kid. My wife was a 16602 kid, so I grew up literally on the wrong side of the tracks in Altoona. She grew up where all the rich people lived, although they weren't rich, they were a railroad family. But there was a bridge called the 12th Street Bridge, and the old 12th Street Bridge was all made of wood. And my Uncle Tony Russo, when I was a little boy, would take me, we called it going over town, he would take me over town on the 12th Street Bridge. And we had so many tracks under that bridge and so many trains and locomotives would go under, that old wooden bridge would start to sway and shimmy back and forth. And you had to actually hold on when you were walking across that bridge because of these powerful locomotives and the vibrations they were causing. That bridge started to swing. Now they have a concrete bridge there, thank goodness. I was scared to go across that bridge when I was a little boy because I was afraid it was going to fall off and onto one of the trains. I'll tell you something else that we did that we shouldn't have done, but when I was a little boy, we would sneak down onto the tracks and they'd have the freight train sitting there and we would get into a boxcar. We'd get into an empty boxcar and we'd ride it up the mountain around the horseshoe curve. And then when it got to the point where it slowed down or stopped, and sometimes we went the whole way to Johnstown, we would get out, jump on another one going the other way, and come back around the horseshoe curve going the other way and take us back into Altoona. And my dad would get so mad. He would always tell me, you're going to get your leg cut off, you're going to get your leg cut off, you're going to fall, you're going to get your leg cut off. But that was one of the things that we did as a kid. But the railroad to us was everything. I mean, the railroad to us it was our city, it was our life, it was our economic support. It was what my dad did for a living. It was what my grandparents did, both my grandfathers did for a living. It was so much woven into the factory, into the fiber of Altoona. And now it's no longer the largest employer. It was for 130 years the largest employer. Now UPMC, which has Altoona Hospital, is the largest employer, and the railroad is the second largest employer now in Blair County. But it's still vital to our local economy. And I still try to do everything I can to help my railroaders because that's who I am. That's where I came from. And that's who I care about. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Are you working with the rest of the country on a program like this?
No, there are states that I think are doing more in terms of developing rail, especially California. They've got some really incredible projects in Southern California. There's one in San Diego now, and they're doing one in Los Angeles. They've got a little bit of a different tax structure than us, California. So their taxes are much, much higher. They do put more, I think, into public transit than we do. But at this point, I'm not looking at working with other states, and we don't really have anything formal in terms of cooperation. I do look at what other states are doing. I do have connections with people who are in other states. I know the mayor of Spokane, Washington, and some people in the mayor's office in Los Angeles. And I go to these transportation symposiums, and we do talk about what's going on in other parts of the country. We don't necessarily work with them on any kind of a formal basis, but we're always exchanging ideas. And the ideas, I will tell you now, the big issue, and it's always the big issue, is funding. Coming up for the resources to invest in this kind of infrastructure. And so I'm always looking at what they're doing in other states in terms of funding, coming up with funding sources for trains and for infrastructure. So in that respect, I'm always paying attention to what other states are doing. But we don't work together on a formal basis. Railroads are the railroads themselves are competitive, the freight railroads. So, I'm an NS guy, Norfolk Southern, because that's my district. The CSX guys don't necessarily want to talk to me because we're competitors. But when it comes to passenger rail, I do talk and have communications with people all over the country. When you look at people who are involved in the transportation community, it's a pretty close-knit community. There aren't a whole lot of people that are involved in transportation on the public policy level. And so when you're in it long enough, you get to meet these people and know who these folks are. I've only been doing this for 9 months, this job, so I've got a lot of catching up to do. But I do have contacts with people who are doing the same sorts of things that we're trying to do here, and we always are bouncing ideas off of each other.
Most of the things would think have to be done at the federal level because there's so much, but you just talk. When I was in grade school, I walked the rail to grade school, did the horseshoe curve,
Yep.
did the high-speed rail in France, and the Danube, the Rhine, the other rivers I rode on.
It's amazing.
The boats.
Yeah.
And I can remember in Cologne, Germany, watching the railroad bridge. That was just train after train after train. You never saw so many trains.
It's unbelievable, and it's a great way to move people. In a lot of the cities in Europe, you can't even take a vehicle into the downtown area. You're not allowed. There's no parking, and it's pedestrians. It's pedestrians only. The federal government plays a huge role, obviously, especially because the Federal Railroad Administration really is the oversight for the railroads. And so when it comes to Amtrak, which is a National Passenger Rail Service Corporation, that's kind of a federal entity. The federal government plays a huge role. We do need help from the federal government in order to do some of the things we want to do.
The Pennsylvania Railroad in 1928, now this was right in the Depression, they started this concept, and they hired Charles Lindbergh as an air advisor.
The pilot.
And they even got Amelia Earhart to pose for publicity. And there's a good picture in the
awesome.
magazine there of her.
Oh, that's awesome.
And so the management there, railroad management there was very forward-looking.
Yes, very innovative. The Pennsylvania Railroad, a lot of people don't know this, the Pennsylvania Railroad at one time was the largest corporation in the world. Biggest corporation in the world, the Pennsylvania Railroad. Very innovative, and the people that they had, the presidents they had, Sam Ray and so forth, these were iconic figures. These were people who were, in fact, one of their past presidents, the Pennsylvania Railroad, during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln brought this former president into his government administration because he needed somebody that could move men and material, cannons, ammunition, whatever, by rail. And they needed somebody that had that expertise because the Union had the rail system. The Confederates didn't have a very good rail system. The Union had a great rail system in the North. So Abraham Lincoln got the head of the Pennsylvania Railroad, brought him into his government and said, you need to help me run these railroads so we can win the war. And in a very real way, those railroads contributed greatly to the North winning the war because we could get men and we could get horses and we could get cannons and artillery and everything where it needed to go a lot faster than the Confederates could by going over land.
In Dublin, Ireland, there's a major street that's strictly walking, and the same thing in Copenhagen. We walk and shop.
Oh,
Look in the windows.
when my wife and I went to Europe, this was the rule. If you buy it, you carry it. Because I knew that if I carried stuff, I would have been a pack mule. By the time, I'd have been a 7-foot pack mule. That's what I would have been. And I said to her, so the rule is you buy it, you carry it. Because I knew I'd had 800 boxes of shoes by the time we left Europe. So she bought some stuff, not much, because she had to carry it. And we were actually in Copenhagen, and I bought some sunglasses. That was all. In fact, got a pair of them right here.
Yeah, my wife bought shoes.
Oh, shoes. Oh, my gosh.
You remember what German city, which she was so disappointed with it.
Well, she didn't realize. She'd see the price, Well, the price was in euros, not dollars. And a euro's worth more than $1. She'd be like, look how cheap these shoes are. I'm like, no, those are euros. You need to get your calculator out. That's not dollars, those are euros. She'd say, oh, what a great deal. These shoes are only $19.99. I said, oh, they're not $19.99. Not in our money, they're not. You need to figure this out and figure out how much they're going to be. But yeah, that was the rule. You buy it, you carry it. Yeah, that's exactly right. So yeah, it was, but that was our experience in Europe. By the way, it was the only time that I didn't see her buy more than 20 pairs of shoes at one time.
Representative, thank you.
Oh, I'm done? Okay, well,
So much,
thank
so
you.
much.